The German Standing Committee on Vaccination has now completely repealed the COVID-19 vaccination recommendation for healthy individuals under 75. Similar steps are being taken in the US, where the dark years of the pandemic are being scrutinized in detail. Involved experts are now raising shocking allegations. Vaccine injuries and a massive excess mortality as a consequence of the vaccination were known from the very start. In this interview with Leland Lehrman, advisor to U.S. Secretary of Health Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I pursue highly explosive questions. Was the vaccination campaign an experiment? Were we humans turned into state property? What role do eugenics and transhumanism play in this? And how do we reclaim our freedom? Leland, a very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's great to be with you again.
Many people suffered massive health damage following the COVID-19 vaccination. The documents presented in the current investigations in the USA indicate that these consequences were known from the start. Isn't that a monstrous accusation?
It is a monstrous accusation. It's almost inconceivable. And sometimes when I think about having to talk about it, it's hard not to cry. The enormity of the allegations are matched only by the enormity of the crime. And unfortunately, in order for us to avoid what happened, we're going to have to face it head on. Cornelia, how are we supposed to make things better if we don't even admit to what they actually are?
Yeah, true. Yes.
Right? So I'll just say a few words about the issues. We know that they knew that the vaccine was dangerous because we have the releases from the studies that they did during the trials. We also know that they ignored whistleblowers who pointed out that there were faults with the studies and that there were serious issues with vaccine side effects. We also know that the post-marketing surveillance data indicated that there were something like 40,000 injuries in the first several days or weeks of the administration of the early injection products. The problem is only gets worse from there when I tell you that that particular study, the post-marketing surveillance data, is the one that the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies asked a court to keep hidden for 75 years. You're probably aware of that. Yes, they knew. Not only that, but the EU in particular, and all the nations of the EU, signed a contract. I have the unredacted version of this contract. They signed a contract with Moderna and Pfizer that says that they know that the side effects are unknown, and they still transferred the liability to the people of the EU, to the governments. And in the case of the Pfizer contract, they were so concerned about the product that they even redefined the definition of fraud. They had to create their own fraud definition in order to hide their activities and legally escape from the consequences as best they could. It's a smoking gun, if you ask me.
Indeed. If one assumes that the subsequent damages of this vaccine material were known, doesn't the grave suspicion arise that a deliberate experiment or even a targeted intent lies behind the global vaccination campaign?
Yes. You know, the European world has not had to face a problem of this scale perhaps since the Second World War, and at least not since the Cold War. What we have to face is a coordinated global effort to reduce population disguised as a public health campaign. And that is a hard topic to talk about. Most of the discussion in Washington, D.C., that you're allowed to have, either in the committee rooms or in polite society, revolves around the question of whether or not this was an accident. But the problem is there is too much foreknowledge. There is too much planning. There are too many events like Event 201 that somehow completely accurately predicted and role played exactly what then just happened. There is too much preparation, 20 odd years of pandemic preparation and biodefense scenario analysis inside the Defense Department and also inside the adjacent non-governmental organizations, the Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum. All of these groups have been repeatedly involved in simulating these type of events. The World Bank has issued bonds with what are called parametric triggers, which only execute when a pandemic is declared. People like Bill Gates, some of the people in the Epstein files, these people are consistently implicated across 20, 30, 40 years in developing this program under the guise of public health. And if you look back even further into history, you can see that the eugenics campaign of the 20th century, which was so roundly and thoroughly and historically condemned, in particular in the German-speaking world after World War II, has unfortunately reared its ugly head once again, but it did so in disguise. The problem is that the disguise was intentional.
Yeah. And with the vaccine mandates, which many people had to comply with due to existential, professional, and social pressures, governments effectively turned the human body into state property and arbitrarily decided over people's health and future. How do you assess this?
It's unconstitutional in the United States of America, and it violates many laws in the EU as well. In particular, it violates the ICPPR or ICCPR Article 7 treaty, which says that even in an emergency, it is not allowable to violate the principle of informed consent. This is a treaty that was signed after Nuremberg, after the Geneva Declarations, in recognition of the principle that there is no emergency that can ever be called which can suspend the right of bodily autonomy and informed consent. The violation of that treaty is the supreme law of the land in both Germany and the United States of America, and the exact same crime is involved and the exact same actors. These are state crimes. Certainly individual named actors and representatives of those states are involved, but unfortunately these are state crimes, and the state actually does have the liability along with the individuals.
True. I will now come to a term that has been heavily burdened in Europe since World War II. It's eugenics. It aims to alter the genetic composition of human beings through targeted measures. Critics claim that the COVID-19 vaccination went in this direction. How is this viewed within your circles?
It's viewed as terrifyingly accurate. The transhumanism community, which includes many very wealthy individuals who are obsessed with these things for their own personal reasons, goes at least all the way back to Julian Huxley, who was a member of the British elite scientific and social establishment that created the original framework for the eugenics justifications. The eugenics tradition actually was born in Britain. It is around the circles around the Huxley family, Charles Darwin's family, and unfortunately even very well-known figures like Winston Churchill, who was the vice president of the Eugenics Society back in those days. The reality is that the British originated eugenics. The Americans picked up the ball in the 19th century. No, in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, and they provided a lot of funding for it on an international basis. Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, they provided an enormous amount of funding even for the German eugenics program. In fact, the Kaiser Wilhelm Eugenics Institute was established with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Institute at Cole Harbor in the United States of America came up with the original sterilization laws, which were implemented in something like 30 United States, and then were enshrined in a decision at the Supreme Court of the United States of America in 1927. And your listeners can look this up online. Look for a decision called Buck versus Bell from 1927. And the famous quote about it is, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The decision was made by the Chief Justice and the entire Supreme Court. I believe the vote was 8-1, that in the United States of America, it was the state was allowed to sterilize people that it thought did not deserve to have children. Interestingly, the judge in this decision wrote that the Jacobson decision from 1905 that allows the state to impose mandatory vaccination requirements also applies to sterilization. And when you realize that Pfizer and all of the important regulatory bodies knew that the Pfizer vaccine specifically collects in the ovaries, the fact that this is not just a eugenics campaign, but also a sterilization operation, which of course are one and the same thing, becomes apparent. Not only are they trying to kill us, they're trying to sterilize us. Just to be clear, it is actually true. I'm very sorry to be the bearer of bad news. It doesn't make me happy to have to say this, but that is what the evidence shows.
And this is absolutely horrible to hear.
Isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
But once you hear it, then maybe we'll start doing something about it, and maybe it will stop. I mean, it was only because of an enormous war that the eugenics operation of the 20th century slowed down, right? Everybody thought about these things enormously. The United States of America had to invent a case. The only problem is that when the United States brought the case against Germany, the German doctors in their defense said, but wait a second, we're just doing the same thing that you guys are doing over there. The German doctors in the United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al., the Nuremberg trial itself. What the German doctors and their legal defense said is, the United States has the same laws and the same program active in its country. We weren't doing anything different, and they weren't wrong on principle. Of course, the United States had only sterilized 60,000 people. That's, outrageous, of course, but it's not the same as what happened in Germany in World War II. And, I know that these are very important distinctions because there are now censorship laws that define what you can and can't say about these issues, which is part of the problem, as you know, because Auf1 is regularly censored.
Yeah. And you wrote an analysis on this topic, the story we were not supposed to tell. And as you state, it is not a pleasant document. It describes how eugenics lives on and is practiced away from the public eye under different terms since the 1960s. You briefly summarized already. Do you have something to add here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are so many details. In order for people to finally understand and get comfortable with the fact that you can't get comfortable with it, but you can at least get comfortable with the fact that we have to do something about it once you see enough of the evidence. The key evidence that I unearthed recently, and it was largely inspired by my trip to Germany that I did this. When I went to Germany and I met with Reiner Fuellmich and I met with Michael Ballweg and I met with the doctors, I saw Reiner Fuellmich in jail. I thought to myself, we have to do something under the Nuremberg Code. We actually have to do this formally. We have to really present the violation of informed consent as an international human rights crime that needs justice. And so when I started to do the research, what I asked, of the internet and all of the other research systems that are available to me, including artificial intelligence, which is very capable as a research tool if used wisely and carefully.
Exactly.
What we discovered when we did the research was that in 1960, after World War II, the eugenics community realized that it was never again going to be possible to argue in public that eugenics was a good idea. The word was completely radioactive. Everybody knew that eugenics was no longer anything that could be considered what they used to like to call it good genetics or good genes. The British translate it well-born, which is kind of standard in British society because they love to think of themselves as being well-born. Anyway, so they have a psychological problem in Great Britain, which makes them think that they're better than everybody else. And those problems are, not uniquely British, but they have a very, very strong case of it, let's just say. So by 1960, which was 13 years after the 1947 decision in the Nuremberg trials, and of course after the executions, the history books had started to get written. The public consciousness of what had happened in Germany and throughout Europe in the name of eugenics was so horrified. The world was so horrified by what happened that the British and the American eugenics advocates realized they were never going to be able to use the word again. And so they decided, and I quote, to use different words to do the same thing. And the word that they chose for their own purposes was crypto-eugenics. Crypto-eugenics means secret eugenics. It means that they explicitly told each other, we're going to keep doing what we were doing, but we are going to hide what we're doing behind other names, behind other programs. And it was at that point that the British Eugenics Society changed its name to the International Planned Parenthood Federation. And they set up population management systems at the United Nations that had the same type of names, like the UN Family Population Council. I can't remember the exact details, but if you look at the document that I wrote, and Cornelia, perhaps you can make it available to the audience. Yeah. All of the details are listed in all of their clarity. And the specific source on this is very important to know. The source of information on all of these details is the Wellcome Trust. And many people will recognize that name as the British Public Health Foundation, largely responsible for vaccination strategy, vaccination funding, vaccination policy, and global health strategy. And one of their most recent executive directors, Jeremy Farrar, is now the World Health Organization's chief scientist. Well, let me tell you a little unknown detail about what the Wellcome Trust did when they first established themselves. One of the first things they did with their $30 billion endowment is acquire the records of the British Eugenics Society. And it's in the records of the British Eugenics Society within the Wellcome Trust archives that you find all the details that I'm now telling you about the fact that they chose to go underground and describe their efforts as crypto eugenics. And then it talks about which UN population fund programs and which naming conventions they were going to use going forward. The best known ones are conservation, public health, family planning, reproductive health, women's empowerment, and of course, pandemic preparedness. All of these are, and transhumanism is directly an invention of Julian Huxley, and he actually stated in the UNESCO founding documents that eugenics is the right policy, and that hopefully UNESCO will slowly be able to educate the world about how important eugenics actually is. It's right there in the founding documents of UNESCO or ECOSOC or UN ECOSOC. I'm not sure of all of the details of the UN's ecological and social branches, but it was the one that Julian Huxley was in charge of and wrote the founding documents for.
I think that will create me sleepless nights too. Okay.
Yes, you know, but you won't feel sleepless if you get busy, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that keeps me alive is actually doing something about it. Yet you can't live with this if you're not doing something about it. But the reality is, many people throughout the world have basically figured this out. It's just this last set of information that proves the case that has compelled me to start talking about it. I used to just know that it was true. I could see the writing was on the wall. I saw all of the planning, Event 201, Crimson Contagion, the United States pandemic, people inside the Defense Department and Johns Hopkins talking about how what you really have to do is pair psychological operations with biowarfare if you really want to paralyze a nation in a war. I knew that there was a lot of planning involved, but it was only recently that I finally did the research after having gone to Germany, having been in Nuremberg, having gone to see the doctors and Michael Ballweg in court and Reiner Fuellmich in jail. And then I was like, we can't be quiet about this anymore.
Absolutely.
We have to talk.
Yeah, yeah. So this thread, this common thread running through eugenics, population reduction, transhumanism, it becomes ever more visible. And with artificial intelligence, robotics, and with chips and sensors that Elon Musk intends to plant into human brains with allegedly good intentions, where do you think are these dark plans leading us?
I'm afraid that these are obvious disasters in the making. And I have seen the public declarations that the 6G communications infrastructure will be explicitly designed to accommodate brain implantation, human beings, as opposed to just cell phones. You know, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be free to experiment with that, but I also think that we all should not just oppose it on health grounds, on safety grounds, and on religious grounds, moral grounds. But I also think that we need to we need to come up with a strategy for describing a credible alternative. And that's something that the health freedom movement worldwide has been pursuing since they started on this trail in 2019 and 2020.
So that's a good point for my next question, as we always want to give our viewers hope. Is there still hope, and how could or should the course be changed to recreate a society of free, dignified, and self-determined human beings? What do you think?
Well, I want to just credit the German-speaking regions, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, for having provided an enormous contribution in this regard throughout history, from the important Swiss victory and establishment of its neutrality status long ago, its reluctance to get involved in any of the destructive wars of the 20th century, and its willingness to provide sanctuary to movements like anthroposophy. Rudolf Steiner, the great Austrian philosopher, also provided an enormous amount of wisdom around the freedom of humanity, both its spiritual freedom as well as its intellectual freedom. So the United States of America and the German-speaking regions, despite our government's egregious violations of these fundamental human principles, both have a long and beautiful and storied history of intellectual freedom and religious freedom. And we need to stand in that tradition and declare its continuing relevance today. Quite frankly, my opinion is that the vision of the future that is offered by 6G, that is offered by the World Economic Forum, is so disgusting, so uninteresting, so morally bankrupt, so romantically unattractive, so entirely illegitimate, that it is our responsibility to create something better, and it shouldn't be very hard. Their offering is so bad. If I were to take their offering and put it in the market and sell it at the farmer's market on a table next to any regular offering of human culture over the last 100 years, indigenous or modern and technological, theirs would never sell. Just wouldn't sell. Nobody's going to buy that. I mean, it's shocking, actually, to imagine that some of these people are getting paid enough money to actually say that this is a good idea. But I honestly think it's a very small percent of very well-paid and often compromised actors at the top of this very sophisticated pyramid structure that they've created that actually believe or are forced to say, for one reason or another, that this is a good idea. There are very many of us. There are very few of them. If we properly organize, we will be able to win quickly. But we have to face the actual facts, and we have to take matters into our own hands, and we have to conduct ourselves in a revolutionary manner consistent with the principles of the United States of America's founding Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and furthermore, even better, the principles of Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and the revolution in the 1960s of peaceful process. Through this, I think we can establish that it's very easy to compete in a marketplace of ideas with the particular ideas that are being advanced under the guise of 6G and the World Economic Forum's vision of it. What did they say? You will own nothing and be happy. I think it's our responsibility to take it upon ourselves and say, we're not waiting for somebody else to fix this problem. We've waited long enough. Now it's our turn. We know it's necessary that we do this, and we are going to do it. What choice do we have? They've given us no other choice.
Yes. Most of all, we have to remove the ignorance of people, and we have to bring out the information, because it's not yet known by people. People are not aware of what's going on there. And of course, we have to challenge the mass media, which are directed by the governments and by the money, the donors to them. So awareness building and information must be very much increased, I think.
Yes, I entirely agree. As I mentioned earlier, I've decided right now that public pressure is the primary vehicle for what needs to happen now, because despite the very noble efforts of the AfD in Germany, and the Enquete Commission happened only 2 weeks prior to the Robert Koch Institute's revision of the COVID-19 vaccination schedule. So it's important to understand that these changes for the better, are not happening by accident. They are actually happening largely as a result of public pressure here in the United States and in Germany. So even though we haven't won every battle, there's been enormous success here under the leadership of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and President Trump, despite the fact that many accountability details have not yet been handled. The progress is enormous. And I think that it's important for us to collaborate so that anytime somebody like the Robert Koch Institute creates a new high water mark of achievement, then we can go back to the United States of America and say, hey, guys, Germany is now better. Well, one of my favorite German philosophers is Friedrich Nietzsche. And one of the things that he says in The Birth of Tragedy, from the Spirit of Music, is that art helps us. Art and culture, they help us to deal with the terrors of life. He says it right there in the first few, 10 pages of that book. But as I was reading it, and I come back to it again and again, what I realized that it's not just art that gives us the courage to confront the terrors of life. It's the pursuit of justice itself. And every time somebody in the world sees that the pursuit of justice has resulted in victory, it gives them a little bit more courage to pursue it in their own life. And one of the ways in which I know this is because when I was finally able to convince Bobby Kennedy to send that statement to Nina Warken regarding the imprisonment and prosecution of German doctors who were simply acting according to their conscience in providing vaccine, mask, and PCR testing exemptions, everybody in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland all of a sudden began to rejoice and say to themselves, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can work with the Americans. Maybe we can somehow get justice, and maybe we can stop all the rest of this nonsense while we're at it. So I feel confident that these statements from the philosophers are still true.
Yes, I'm sure they are true. And it's a very good statement for the end of this interview that should give hope to our viewers and will give hope to our viewers.
I hope so.
Yeah, and we are our TV Auf1, we will continue, we will fight for the truth, we will present the truth, and also with your help, we build this bridge, which is very important to stop this nonsense and this crime.
It simply has to be done. Yes. I cannot rest easy if I am not working on this with every available moment in my day. And as long as I do that, I'm very happy.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Leland. Thank you for taking your time, and our viewers will really appreciate this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cornelia. Feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Yes, I will. Thank you.